My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be The Poetic Novel, Part 2, Video 7, The Search for Form. Here's the book from which I'm going to read. The Poetic Novel 2, Influences and Elements, 3 Yellow Roses. A rose is a rose is a rose, said Gertrude Stein by John Passfield. Influences and elements. Influences because I'm writing about writers who have influenced my own writing. Elements because I'm writing about techniques that I have developed for the poetic novel. So that's the book from which I'm going to read the essay. Here's another book. I'm going to mention it at some point, so I'll just hold it up now rather than fish around for it as I'm reading. This is my novel, Eleonora Dusa, Let Me Have My Wings, okay? So I'll refer to that as I go on. It's interesting how certain images occur and recur in a person's thoughts over many years. One of the images that keeps occurring to me, and I have no idea when I first thought of this image as a very significant image for me, is the image of a cart with two horses and a driver. The image has a positive and a negative version. When the two horses are pulling in harmony, it is a positive image. But when one horse moves ahead of the other, the cart is skewed and does not go straight on the path. So I'm going to read 5 segments from a 14th segment essay, The Search for Form. So here's segment number 1. I'm in the process of creating my own myth, M-Y-T-H, my own myth about what literature is and how it works. A myth is an idea pattern into which to fit items of information, so each item of information takes on a meaning, which is its relationship to the other items of information. Currently, I see my literature myth as having 3 parts, 3 blocks of ideas. So number 1, Shakespeare. That's a block of ideas, a cluster of information. Number 2, the modernist writers, cluster of information about the modernist writers. And 3, myself, my own writing. For a long time, in my planning notebooks, as my planning notebooks and journals will show, I thought of myself as following in the mode of the modernist writers, as I felt that I've learned much from them as to how to write my kind of novels, and I felt that I was developing the form of the novel beyond what they had achieved in their writings and in their theories. As for Shakespeare, though, he was separate in my thoughts. As a writer whose plays I taught more of, and more often than the writings of any other writer, I'd studied criticism about his works with more profit in terms of my theories of writing than that of any other writer, and I'd always thought of him as the greatest writer of any age within my limits as a reader of English literature and non-English literature and translation literature. I originally thought of Shakespeare as the most talented of writers, and having written in a form which I'd originally thought when I was in my 20s was still viable, but that I'd come to see as antiquated and no longer viable as a form which writers of later centuries could employ. Now later, I came to see that I could separate the idea of Shakespeare, this cluster of thoughts about Shakespeare, into 3 separate categories. Number 1, Shakespeare's talent, not equaled by any other writer, certainly not by me. Number 2, Shakespeare's form, the Elizabethan Jacobean play. And number 3, Shakespeare's concept of imagery, not only still viable, but the same concept of imagery that's been employed in the creating of serious literature from Homer to now. Through the great classical Greek playwrights, through Chaucer and the great poetic prose novelists such as Dostoevsky and Emily Bronte, and on to the modernists such as Woolf and Proust, and on presumably to the 20th and 21st century works of literature which I do not read. It was a 3-part realization that the individual talent dies with the writer, that the form dies with the era, but that literary technique is universal and timeless, that allowed me to perceive my relationship with my two persistent and influential literary interests, Shakespeare and the modernists. Shakespeare, whom I'd seen as my chief source of inspiration, but who was somehow not connected to the modernist writers, with whom I saw myself as having the most affinity in my quest for a novel form, and the modernists, whose quest for form I felt I was continuing, standing on their shoulders, of course, but seeing further than they had managed to see, and finally myself, and the form that I brought to a quite high level of outer shape and inner complexity, and with the possibility within that form of novel by novel variation, with my latest variation on that form being my 27th novel, which I held up, Eleanor Dusa, Let Me Have My Wings. So this essay was written a few years ago. I've gone beyond that novel and written others, novels and novellas since that time. At last, I feel I can summarize my thoughts on these topics, which once seemed so disparate, just a whole bunch of ideas not related. I can now explain to myself the myth about literature, what it is and how it works that will give me a placement for the information about all three topics of interest. So I needed a cupboard, a form, a shape into which to fit all this information, so it all belonged under one umbrella in a sense. Shakespeare, the modernist, and myself as writer, which will make all of the items of information relate meaningfully to one another. They're not separate, but I took a long time to figure out how they relate. Okay, segment 2 of this essay from my book, The Poetic Novel 2. Excuse me again. I'm creating an evolving myth. Excuse me, I just have this frog in my throat. Excuse me. I'm creating an evolving myth, which I would say has gone through 3 stages, with the latest one, the 4th, bringing the early concepts together as one overall idea concept, the current version of my literary myth. So here are the 4 stages. Number 1. Early on in my notes, I would often write that all of serious literature involves the creation of an objective correlative, borrowing the term from T.S. Eliot, which I took to mean that a writer creates, in words, an idea pattern, which is the pattern in images of the deepest level of thought in his or her mind. Okay, number 2. As time went on, I would often write that all of serious literature involves a battle of images, as I was heavily influenced by such critics as Una Ellis Fermer and Wolfgang Clement, both of whom I've written about in my book, The Poetic Novel 1, who explored and explained the role of imagery in the serious literature that I was reading. The Iago imagery drives the Desdemona imagery temporarily out of the mind of Othello, and so on. That's the battle of the imagery, right? The battle inside Othello's mind, the Iago imagery versus the Desdemona imagery, and so on. Okay, number 3. Lately, I've taken to writing that all of serious literature concerns myth building, M-Y-T-H, myth building. The writer builds a personal myth, a personal objective correlative, a personal idea pattern, when he or she creates a poetic play or a poetic novel. And the main character and the secondary characters also build personal myths, personal objective correlatives, personal idea patterns, which they either keep to themselves or attempt to impose on other characters. Iago has a myth in his mind. If he fits all of the disparate information into that myth, and then he tries to impose it on Othello. Number 4. Now I would tie these theories together by writing that all of serious literature concerns the search for form. For the writer, the shape of the poetic play or poetic novel is the attempt by the writer to create an idea form in words which will serve that writer as a personal objective correlative, a personal idea pattern, a personal myth, which will be the pattern of his or her thoughts, of his or her personal response in imagery and in print to his or her experience of the self, the society, and the universe of that person's situation. And, secondly, for the main character, and in less detail for the other characters as well. The idea quest of the poetic play or the poetic novel is the attempt by the main character to create an idea form in his or her mind, which will serve that character as a personal objective correlative, a personal idea pattern, a personal myth, which will be the pattern of his or her thoughts, of his or her personal response, in imagery which is not in print. Key point there, not in print, to his or her life experience of a self, the society and the universe of that character's situation. So one is in print, the writer's objective correlative. One is not in print, the character's objective correlative. It was my inability to grasp this last point about the main character that baffled me, and that finally led to a breakthrough in my thoughts. I felt that I understood that a writer is creating an item of literature which is an objective correlative of his or her thoughts. I was writing poetic novels in which I felt that there were two objective correlatives. I, as a writer, was creating items of literature which were objective correlatives of my thoughts. The same words, the 50,000 words of each of my novels, such as Eleonora Duse, were also an objective correlative for each main character. That the main character of each novel was creating an image pattern. The same item of literature that I was creating, which was an objective correlative of his or her, Eleonora Duse's thoughts. Now, here's the third section of this essay. As an aside, of course, the item of literature was an idea pattern which was expressed in imagery. So the thoughts which the imagery suggested to myself, the writer, and to the main character were not necessarily the same thoughts. Imagery by, wrong page here. Imagery by definition, my definition, is information which must be interpreted in light of other related information, and all interpretation is speculative thought. I was writing the imagery of the character's mind as his or her objective correlative, but I was not writing the main character's thoughts, just as the play Hamlet is the imagery of Shakespeare's mind, but not his thoughts. We can only speculate about what the imagery of the play Hamlet meant to the writer Shakespeare. Okay, here's the fourth segment of this essay. I'm going to read 5 segments. So, if I was writing two objective correlatives, mine as the writer and that of my main character, and if Shakespeare as a writer was writing his personal objective correlative in the imagery of the play Hamlet, then where, I was wondering, was the objective correlative that the main character Hamlet was creating? The answer gave me the latest idea breakthrough in my theory of literature. 5th section, section 5. I've just completed my 27th novel, Eleonora Duse, Let Me Have My Wings. All along, I've been on a double quest. Number 1, develop a form for the poetic novel of my time, the 21st century, and 2, to develop a theory of literature which will tie all of my interests together, and in particular explain to me the relationship between form and technique. It now seems to me that there are two definitions of form. Form 1, the genre in which a writer shapes his information-turned imagery, such as the epic poem, the classical Greek poetic play, the Elizabethan Jacobean play, the modernist novel. And number 2, form 2, the inner shape, which is the product of the poetic techniques which are common to all writers in all ages and all genres. So that's the thing, to finally put your finger on what is true of all serious literature, all genres in any era and all eras. What's always true? Okay, my theory is that the topics of the surface of an item of literature are personal to a writer and to an era. The Great Gatsby reflects F. Scott Fitzgerald's life experiences and interests. New York, Long Island, bootlegging, mansions, Dutch sailors viewing the New World, etc. Perhaps the 1920s to 1950s delay in the evaluation of such modernist writers as Faulkner, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald is due to their penchant for taking their topics from their personal milieu. Fitzgerald's 1920s gangster story looked out of date to the critics of the 1930s. The early critics didn't realize that these novels utilized contemporary and personal imagery to explore timeless ideas about human thought and behavior. So, the genre, form 1, reflects the writer's era and personal choice. The Great Gatsby is a novel which is similar to novels of the time in which it was written, but with a uniqueness which draws on such disparate novels as those of Booth Tarkington and Joseph Conrad. Number 2, the techniques formed to give a work of literature what I would call an inner shape. Such techniques as the juxtaposition of prose narrative and deepening imagery is common to Shakespeare and to Gatsby. So to put your finger on what's common to all great literature. In Shakespeare, it is the dialogue of a political intrigue in Hamlet or Macbeth being deepened by the poetic imagery of the dialogue and the soliloquies. And Gatsby is the Valley of Ashes as both a prose setting for some of the action of a story and the Valley of Ashes as an image of spiritual sterility. The ashes imagery is juxtaposed with the plot devices, such plot devices as Gatsby's mansion and his limousine, which also serve as deepening imagery. The Dutch sailors are deepening imagery, but do not double as prose plot information. There are no Dutch sailors in the story. They are pure imagery. They are there as deepening imagery to add suggested meaning to that novel. My point is that such techniques as the juxtaposition of seemingly disparate imagery and the insertion of deepening imagery in an action narrative are literary elements that are always valid and are always employed in serious literature, irresponsive of genre, era, or personal writing style. Now, I'll stop there. As mentioned, I've read only part of that essay. The complete essay can be found on my website, johnpassfield.ca. And now I'll read a note that I wrote as I reviewed this essay for video presentation. So here's a new note about an older essay. I'm very fortunate as a writer in that I never seem to suffer from writer's block, and I never seem to suffer from the need to have a long passage of time between the writing of 2 items of fiction. When I got interested in literature, it was natural for me to seek out criticism about the works of fiction I was reading, not because I wanted to adopt, holus bolus, the thoughts of other people about the literature that I was reading, but rather because I wanted to stimulate my own mind to think on topics that I might not otherwise have thought about if I had not read the interpretations, the opinions of other readers. Now, in seeking out criticism of the writings of the authors whose books I found so interesting, it was natural to read the criticism that some of these same authors themselves had written. I suppose I could say I was surprised, though, on looking back over about 60 years as a reader of fiction, that I found very few writers of novels who've written very extensively about the art and craft of writing. The only 2 whom I can think of who left more than a few brief notes are Henry James and Virginia Woolf. Henry James left his notebooks and prefaces, and Virginia Woolf left her diaries. So very few writers write about theory, and those 2 are the exception. If I were to distinguish between these 2 writers, I'd say that Henry James had a much clearer theory about the writing of his books than did Virginia Woolf about the writing of her books. With reference to these 2 writers, I believe that the development of a very clear and very thorough theory about the writing of one's own fiction is very important to a writer if one is to avoid suffering from writer's block while working on a particular item of literature, or suffering from those long periods of inaction when one has finished one writing project and cannot imagine what the next writing project could possibly be. So, the 2 horses that pull the cart are creativity and theory. If one pulls ahead of the other, the cart is skewed. The cart is not running straight on the road. So once again, this is my book, The Poetic Novel 2, Influences and Elements. It's found only on my website. It's not on Amazon. It's not an actual book in that sense that can be purchased. It's not found on my publisher's website. It's found at johnpassfield.ca. You just click on the cover icon and it pops up on the screen. It's yours to read for free. So if you're interested in literary theory, have a look at The Poetic Novel 2. And lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.